Lecture 33, we're going to talk about 4 decisive campaigns of the Civil War, and then I'm going to make a few marks about Appomattox, and then that will wrap up this semester. We're going to talk about Vicksburg and Gettysburg in 1863, Sherman's March in 64-65, and then the Overland Campaign in Virginia between Lee and Grant that will end the war in 64-65. Starting with Vicksburg, of course, Vicksburg is part of the Anaconda Plan to take the Mississippi from the south. This will divide the South, obviously, and take that waterway away from the South. And it'll allow Union troops to prevent food from moving eastward from Louisiana and Texas. And General Grant, of course, will be given the task of capturing Vicksburg. Vicksburg is the last major stronghold on the Mississippi. You can see from our maps here that the Mississippi River looks like a big ball of twine that someone's tossed on the ground. It's quite convoluted here, running east, west, north, and south as it approaches Vicksburg. Vicksburg is high up on the banks of the Mississippi River on the eastern bank. Confederate artillery command the river there. Grant makes a number of attempts to take Vicksburg, and they fail. Union gunboats cannot knock out Confederate artillery because the Confederate cannon is so high up on the bluffs. An attempt to take Vicksburg from the north is a failure. The ground is too swampy. The infantry can't maneuver in it. Grant will eventually undertake a rather daring campaign, something that's still studied today at West Point and other military academies. Grant will move downriver from Vicksburg and will cross his army over into the state of Mississippi. From that point, and you can look at the campaign map here that we provided for you, you'll notice that Grant does not simply turn north and march parallel to the river to capture Vicksburg. He seeks out the Confederate armies in the state of Mississippi and destroys them first. He goes to Jackson and defeats the Confederate forces there, and then he turns west and begins moving on Vicksburg. He defeats other Confederate forces that block his path. He lays siege to Vicksburg, essentially starving the city into submission. General Pendleton of the Confederate forces will surrender in the first week of July, 1863. This is a decisive campaign. It reduces Confederate resistance in the far western theater. It opens the Mississippi entirely to the U.S. Navy, and it allows Grant to move east and take command of Union forces at Chattanooga, where he will lead another victory. Now, our second decisive campaign will take place at Gettysburg at the same time that Vicksburg is taking place. In fact, the two battles will culminate at virtually the same time in early July 1863. General Lee had convinced the Southern President, Jefferson Davis, that an invasion of the North was proper. Lee said, number one, Northern Virginia had been stripped of its food, and that Lee needed to move his army into the lush fields of Maryland and Pennsylvania to feed his men and horses. Lee also said that by invading Pennsylvania, that perhaps he could draw General Grant away from Vicksburg, force Grant to move back east to try to defend the capital. Lee, of course, also wanted to get the Army of the Potomac out in the open and perhaps destroy it and maybe bring this war to a close. The problem with the Gettysburg campaign begins early, as the eyes and ears of Lee's army, the Confederate cavalry under General Jeb Stuart, instead of properly fulfilling their function of being the eyes and ears of the army and letting Lee know where the Army of the Potomac is located and in what number, how many corps, etc., etc., Stuart goes on a wild ride trying to repeat a performance that he had earlier conducted in Virginia, where he rode completely around McClellan's army on the peninsula. He tries it again here, and what it leads to is that General Lee is moving forward into Maryland and Pennsylvania completely blind. He has no idea where the Army of the Potomac is and in what strength, and he's quite surprised that that the Army of the Potomac is approaching his flank as he enters Pennsylvania. He brings his 3 corps of his army together at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's a nice road network, roads approaching from north, east, west, and south. So at Gettysburg, the Army of the Potomac begins to concentrate, and the Army of Northern Virginia concentrate. And a terrible 3-day battle is fought here. Confederate successes on the first day tend to drive the Union forces onto very strong defensive positions. Confederate assaults on the second day, although achieve some success, they do not achieve any sort of decisive success. And then on the third day, we have the legendary and disastrous attack on the Federal center at Pickett's charge. This is a debacle. The attack is broken. The Union forces remain intact. They are not driven from the hills there at the center of the Union line. And Lee's army is badly damaged. General Lee will stay there in position one more day, again, daring the Union to attack, and they do not. And then only after that does Lee retreat back into Virginia. Now, take these 2 events that culminate in the first week of July, 1863, the loss of the Confederates at Vicksburg and the defeat of Lee's army at Gettysburg. Here is the true turning point of the war. From this point forward, the Union will keep the initiative, and Confederates will be in retreat for the most part. The third campaign that I wanted to mention here is Sherman's Atlanta campaign and the march through Georgia. By 1864, Ulysses S. Grant's been appointed commander of all Union forces. He goes to Virginia to carry out the fight against Robert E. Lee. He appoints his chief lieutenant, William Tecumseh Sherman, to command the Union Army in Tennessee. And Sherman proposes to march against Atlanta, and he will fight a series of battles against General Joe Johnston, the Confederate commander, at Dalton and Resaca and Kingston, and then, of course, finally at Kennesaw Mountain is the largest of these battles. After Kennesaw Mountain, General Johnson will retreat to the Chattahoochee River and then be relieved of command. He's replaced by General John Bell Hood. Hood is not nearly the tactician that Johnson was. Johnson managed to keep his army together, intact, and Hood is going to rapidly waste this army on useless attacks against the Federal forces. General Sherman will capture Atlanta in September of 1864, and this not only has military ramifications in that Atlanta, then as it is today, is a major transportation hub, but it has political ramifications. The election will be in just a couple of months, and despair in the North gives way to some sense of celebration after Sherman announces that he has captured Atlanta. This victory is going to push Lincoln into a second term as president. Now, after capturing Atlanta, what to do with Sherman's army? Hood takes the Confederate army and instead of trying to defend the rest of Georgia, he departs and goes north towards Kentucky, Tennessee, which is fine with Sherman. Sherman tells Grant that he'll march on Savannah and he'll rip up the railroads and shake the confidence and the psychological strength of the Southern people by doing it. This, of course, is Sherman's famous march through Georgia, where he burns the infrastructure, tears up the railroads, destroys the bridges, breaks the china, kills chickens, pigs, cows, destroys the supplies in the barns, and makes the civilian population of the South feel the war up close and personal. Some military historians have described this as total war, the beginning of modern war, things like this. Sherman, of course, will capture Savannah in the winter of '64. I believe he presents it as a Christmas present to the President of the United States. And of course, he's not finished. Once he captures Savannah, Sherman is going to turn north and take his brand of war into South Carolina. I believe Sherman remarks that South Carolina started this mess and they're going to have to pay for it. And he marches to Columbia and burns and destroys as he moves through South Carolina the same way as he did in Georgia. The ultimate purpose of Sherman's march at this point now, of course, is to move north towards Virginia, putting pressure on Robert E. Lee's southern flank, which takes us to the fourth decisive campaign, and that's sometimes referred to as the Overland Campaign. This is the heavyweight championship fight between Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. The Army of the Potomac moving south against Richmond, with Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia trying to protect Richmond and at the same time trying to destroy Grant's army. A series of truly horrific battles are fought here. First in the wilderness, where Grant is handled very roughly by Lee. Both flanks are turned. He nearly has his lines of communication cut off. He suffers casualties, astronomical casualties. Yet, unlike the previous Northern commanders, Grant, after this very bloody battle, he doesn't turn and retreat. He continues south. The next set-piece battle at Spotsylvania will bring into mind the type of combat you'll see in World War I. Heavy entrenchments, massive assaults by infantry into the face of withering fire. This campaign will continue as Grant moves by the left flank over and over, trying to outrace Lee to the Confederate capital in Richmond. Lee will manage to keep his army between Grant and Richmond until a siege begins, and the siege will last the better part of 9 months, with Grant extending his lines. Grant has much the larger army, and therefore he can extend his lines continually to the left, forcing Lee to extend his lines to meet Grant's. Lee, of course, has about half the number of troops, and there's a limit to how thin the Confederate lines will become. In the spring of 1865, of course, Grant will finally break Lee's lines south of Petersburg, and Lee will abandon his position protecting Richmond and will flee westward. Grant's combined forces will box Lee in at Appomattox, and of course the surrender of Lee's army will take place there in April of 1865. I want to say one word here about Appomattox. I think it's a significant meeting here between Grant and Lee. Let's face it, it did not have to work out the way it did. Grant, I suppose, could have hung Lee for treason or thrown Lee in jail along with Longstreet and the other Confederate commanders. I guess he could have marched the Army of Northern Virginia into prison camp. He didn't. He allowed everyone to go home. He allowed the officers to keep their sidearms and their horses. He knew planting season was coming up and these men would need their horses. He had the men, Lee's men, swear that they would not take up arms against the Union, and ended the war in a spirit of reconciliation. If Grant had been a different sort of man and had imposed harsh conditions on Lee and Lee's men, then it's conceivable that the Civil War could have continued with guerrilla warfare, with partisan warfare in the South, sniping, assassinations, so on and so forth, with lasting bitterness that now, of course, belongs in the past for the most part. So Appomattox is important in that it's the first step towards reconciling the two halves of the country. And of course, President Lincoln is assassinated just after this surrender, bringing the Civil War to a close and robbing the nation of Lincoln's leadership, which the United States could have certainly used during the war, during the years of Reconstruction that will follow. So that ends the American Civil War and the surrender at Appomattox. Thanks for your attention.